In Chapter 7, we're going to look at food preparation processes, including thawing, produce washing, cooking, cooling, and reheating. When thawing frozen foods, the safest way is to take the foods out of the freezer and put them in the refrigerator at 41 degrees or below and let them thaw completely. Another acceptable way to thaw frozen foods is to thaw them under potable running water with a temperature of 70 degrees or below. It is important that the water be continuously running and that no part of the food gets above 41 degrees. You may also thaw frozen foods in a microwave as long as the food is then immediately cooked. You may not thaw food in the microwave and then put it back into the refrigerator to store. You can also thaw frozen foods as part of the conventional cooking process by taking them directly out of the freezer and throwing them onto the grill or cooking them in some other way. All produce used in a food establishment must be washed before being cut or sliced. If you have produce that has an edible rind and is served whole, it must be washed prior to being served. When washing produce, it is important to remove all soil and to remove any stickers. You may wash your produce in a prep sink if you have one, or in a 3-compartment sink if you wash and sanitize the compartment first. You may not wash produce in a hand sink or in a mop sink. Cooking is the most effective step that we have for reducing bacterial contamination of foods to levels that make the food safe to eat. Cooking foods will not kill any bacterial toxins that have been formed or any spores from spore-forming bacteria. Also, if food has been mishandled and large amounts of bacteria have been allowed to grow, the cooking process may not kill enough of those bacteria to make the food safe to eat. So foods need to be kept under proper conditions even if you are going to cook them at some point. The mandatory minimum cooking temperatures are specified in Section 4-26 of the 1st District Health Unit Food Code. All parts of the food must reach the minimum cooking temperature. The coldest part of the food is most likely to be in the middle or close to the bone, so that is where the temperature should be checked. The foods must be at the minimum cooking temperature for at least 15 seconds. The cooking temperatures specified here are the minimum cooking temperatures. You may use higher temperatures in your establishment if you desire. For foods of plant origin, cook them to an internal temperature of at least 135 degrees. For eggs, there are 2 cases. For eggs that are broken and immediately cooked for an individual's order, you must cook them to at least 145 degrees. For any other form of eggs, such as batched eggs, or quiche, or cookie dough, you must cook to an internal temperature of at least 155 degrees. For any whole piece of fish, such as a fish fillet, you should cook it to at least 145 degrees. For any kind of ground fish, or any food that contains ground fish, you should cook it to at least 155 degrees. For stuffed fish, or any kind of stuffing that contains fish, you should cook it to at least 165 degrees. Meat includes beef, lamb, goat, and ratite, such as emu and ostrich. For cooking a whole piece of meat, you must cook it to at least 145 degrees. When cooking ground or tenderized meat products, or food that contain ground or tenderized meats, you have to cook them to at least 155 degrees. When cooking stuffed meat, or any kind of stuffing that contains meat, you must cook it to at least 165 degrees. Whole muscle intact meat, like beef steaks, may be cooked to customer's order as long as the external surfaces of the steak reach a temperature of at least 145 degrees. This holds true only if it is being served immediately. If a beef steak is cooked to put into a steam table or on a buffet line, it must be cooked to a temperature of 145 degrees throughout. When serving immediately, As long as the surface temperature of 145 degrees is reached, the internal temperature is not as critical. When cooking a whole piece of pork, such as a pork chop, it must be cooked to a temperature of at least 155 degrees. When cooking ground pork, or any food that contains ground pork, it must be cooked to a temperature of at least 155 degrees. When cooking stuffed pork, or any stuffing that contains pork, it must be cooked to a temperature of at least 165 degrees. Game animals include things such as buffalo, elk, deer, rabbit, squirrel, bear, rattlesnake, and yak. But all of these animals must be USDA inspected. They must come from an approved source. You may not go out and harvest game animals and use them in a food establishment. A whole piece of game animal must be cooked to at least 155 degrees. Ground game animals must be cooked to at least 155 degrees. And stuffed game animals, or stuffing containing game animals, must be cooked to at least 165 degrees. Poultry, whether it is whole, ground, or stuffed, must be cooked to a temperature of at least 165 degrees. To go through some examples, an ear of corn must be cooked to at least 135 degrees. Roast beef, which is a whole piece of meat, must be cooked to at least 145 degrees. Raw beef sausage, which is ground meat, must be cooked to at least 155 degrees. A pork chop, which is a whole piece of pork, must be cooked to at least 155 degrees. A buffalo steak, which is a whole piece of game animal, must be cooked to a temperature of at least 155 degrees. A beef hamburger must be cooked to a temperature of at least 155 degrees. And a roast turkey must be cooked to a temperature of at least 165 degrees. It is important to use a thermometer to verify that you reach the proper temperature. In your food establishment, you are required to have a thermometer that is appropriate to the foods that are being cooked. When taking the temperature, you should always take it in the coldest part of the food, so at the center or near the bone. It is important to clean and sanitize the thermometer stem before you check the temperature of a food and in between different foods. This picture shows the 3 approved types of food thermometers. On the left is a bimetallic stem thermometer. This type of thermometer is appropriate for checking the temperature of foods where the temperature is uniform throughout the food, like in a pot of soup. Stir the food and insert the thermometer so that at least half of the stem is in the food. In the middle is a digital stem thermometer. A digital thermometer is the best type of thermometer overall to use in a food establishment. This type will have a mark on the stem. Insert the stem into the food at least up to the mark. On the right is a thermocouple. Thermocouples are a good thermometer choice to use in a food establishment, but can be expensive. Insert the tip of the probe into the food to the depth desired to take a temperature. Cooling is a food preparation process that takes a food through the danger zone, so it must be done quickly to prevent the growth of bacteria. You must take the food from 135 degrees to below 41 degrees within 6 hours, provided that the food cools from 135 degrees to below 70 degrees in the first 2 hours, and then cools from below 70 degrees to below 41 degrees in the final 4 hours. If the food that you're cooling misses either of these time temperature criteria, it may no longer be safe and must be discarded. It is important to monitor both time and temperature while cooling foods to make sure you meet all appropriate criteria. Cool foods that are greater than 135 degrees down to as close to 135 degrees as possible using means such as an ice bath. Break large quantities of food down into smaller portions. Cut large pieces of meat into smaller pieces, or put liquid food into small, shallow pans. Cover these foods loosely or leave them uncovered, and then put them into a cooler directly in front of the cooling unit to take advantage of the moving air to cool the food down. If you make soup, prepare water-based soups in a condensed version. Then add the appropriate amount of ice to make up the water that you need. Any foods made in a food establishment and held overnight shall be labeled with the date that they were made. Any foods that are made in a food establishment and cooled down and labeled must be used or thrown away within 7 days of the date that they were made. When reheating foods, it is important to go through the danger zone as quickly as possible. Reheat foods from a temperature that is below 41 degrees to at least 165 degrees within 2 hours. Stir the food while reheating for better transfer of heat. If a microwave is used to reheat foods, heat to at least 165 degrees throughout, then let stand for 2 minutes. This is the end of Chapter 7.